Chapter 5, Gender Fair Language. Learning Outcomes. At the end of this chapter, the students should be able to identify the ways language discriminates against women, state forms of discrimination in language, and explain how gender fair language can be realized. Language and gender relations. Language is a potent tool for how humans understand and participate in the world. It can shape how we see society. It is a part of culture. In this regard, language is not a neutral force. It enforces certain ideas about people, including gender. Many gendered assumptions are present when it comes to language. Language defines men and women differently, as seen in common adjectives associated with these genders. Unequal relations can stem from statements that trivialize one gender's experience or perpetuate one gender's supremacy. It evaluates gender in so much as language trivializes or devalues certain characteristics. Thelma Quintanar and Angeli Tongson, in their 2014 book Gender Fair Language, a Primer, focused on three aspects of language that inform how gender is shaped. Language articulates consciousness, reflects culture, and affects socialization. Like gender stereotyping, language influences how one sees his or her gender and perceives other people's gender. Violations of gender fair language. Sexist language is a tool that reinforces unequal gender relations through sex role stereotypes, microaggressions, and sexual harassment. Language can be used to abuse, such as in the case of sexual harassment, or to perpetuate stereotypes. It can form subtle messages that reinforce unfair relations, such as how men cannot take care of children, or women cannot be engineers, which may impact how one views his or her capabilities. All in all, language is a powerful force that plays a significant role in how one perceives the world. Quintanar and Tongson gave extensive examples of these violations in her book. The following are condensed versions and real life examples of violations of gender fair language. Invisibilization of women. The invisibilization of women is rooted in the assumption that men are dominant and are the norm of the fullness of humanity, and women do not exist. Some obvious examples of women invisibilization in language are the generic use of masculine pronouns for the use of a masculine general. The use of the word mankind assumes that men are representative of all people on this planet, and that women's presence or roles are not acknowledged. Similarly, saying guys when referring to a mixed gender group assumes that girls are invisible and calls attention to the male gender, giving them a stronger presence. The assumption that certain functions or jobs are performed by men instead of both genders. For example, the sentences, the farmers and their wives tilled the land, or the politicians and their wives lobbied for change, Assume that men can have jobs as farmers and politicians, and women who do the same work are still made to be known as wives, with their identities forever linked to being married to their husbands. The use of male job titles or terms ending in man to refer to functions that may be given to both genders. For instance, the titles businessman and chairman assume that all businessmen or chairmen are men and that certain jobs may not be for women, which is not true. Trivialization of women. Bringing attention to the gender of a person if that person is a woman. The use of lady, girl, or woman along with the noun brings attention to the gender of the person rather than the job or function. Examples of this include girl athlete, woman doctor, lady guard, and working wives. This notion also works for men who enter traditionally female jobs, such as male nurses, male nannies, and male secretaries. The perception of women as immature. Women may be labeled as darling or baby by those who do not know them, making them appear childlike or juvenile. The objectification or likening to objects of women. By being called honey, sweets, or chick, women become devalued, especially if they are in an environment that merits formalities such as the workplace. Fostering unequal gender relations. Language that lacks parallelism fosters unequal gender relations. The use of man and wife assumes that men are still men and women's identities are subsumed and shifted into beings in relation to their husbands. Gender polarization of words in use of adjectives. The personal care brand Dove recently came out with an advertisement that used parallel adjectives to show the difference in perception regarding men and women. Both men and women did the same activity, but were described differently. In the ad, when men in the ad, men who took the lead were considered the boss, while women who had the same initiative were considered bossy. Men who worked overtime were seen as providers, while women who did the same were seen as uncaring. This polarization of adjectives shows how perception does change how one sees certain acts, depending on who performs them. Hidden assumptions. Hidden assumptions in sentences can also be forms of microaggression if the underlying perceptions are sexist and degrading. For example, the statement, the father is babysitting his children, assumes that the father is not a caregiver and that any attempt he has at parenting is temporary, and as the mother is the main caregiver. A typical example of a situation involving sexist language is shown in the following sample case. Aaron mentioned that his friends from his all boys high school would often use the word bakla as an insult. They would also use bakla to describe someone who lost at games or was weak at sports. He stopped doing this in college. He shared that he already grew up and stopped using terms like bakla as an insult because he knows that doing so may hurt someone who is actually gay. Perhaps Aaron sees gender sensitivity in language as a sign of maturity. Philippine culture and language. Filipino or Tagalog is mainly gender neutral, without gendered characteristics or titles for men and women. Words that are gendered came from another culture, which were adopted after 400 years of colonization. The values and the shaping of the education system were influenced by Western powers and ideals. Filipinos portray a mix of identities, an infusion of both native and foreign perspectives and values. Identities and naming things. The previous chapter defined sex and gender and explained how these points can help reflect one's identity. Language is used to define what is feminine, masculine, and outside feminine or masculine. It is a tool for understanding the world as well as for naming and describing people and things. Language gives a person the power to define oneself and external world and one's place in it. It provides a definition of others as well and one's relationship with them. Through language, people can reflect on their own gendered identities and battle the definitions society imposes on them. Naming things give them power. For example, sexual harassment was never seen as an issue as it was never given a name. It was unwanted behavior in the workplace, but was seen as something that could not be contended with. Because it was unnamed, it was ignored by those in power as if it did not exist. Recognizing harassment for what it is by defining and describing the act help women around the world put mechanisms that would address workplace harassment. Similarly, women who experienced date rape had no term to describe that occurred to them, but naming their experience helped them come to terms with their issue. Another example of the problem that has no name was given by Betty Friedan in her book The Feminine Mystic in 1963. Friedan described it as the discontent that middle class housewives felt in the United States during the 1950s to 1960s. In naming the issue that her fellow housewives felt, Friedan was able to highlight the structural oppression experienced by housewives, that despite their basic needs being met, they themselves were unable to take control of their lives due to the limits the society enforces on their reproductive roles. Sexist language and culture. A previous chapter noted that gender socialization is the process in which roles are learned. Language that admonishes certain acts depending on one's gender is a form of externalized social control. Common themes of a sexist language are the commercialization of the and the trivialization of women. These sexist portrayals of women extend to the advertising industry, entertainment industry, and the arts. The normalization of sexism makes violence against women and children acceptable or tolerable. Using language for gender stereotyping can contribute to sexism by reinforcing the idea that certain words and traits should only be associated with specific genders. How people related to each other on a day to day basis reinforces behavior, both positive and negative. To call someone stupid every day could have an effect on his or her potential. In turn, language, through its repetition of roles, stereotypes, and adjectives, affects how one person enacts his or her capabilities. Constantly mocking or joking about women or LGBT, sexualizing them and making them appear weak would indeed make them internalize these ideas. That being said, language is not inherently sexist. Being sexist depends on a specific culture. Similarly, the attitude of a culture towards a certain gender may influence the words used, creating sexist language. Language is both a symptom and a perpetrator of sexism, and is the very telling of how a society sees a certain gender. Toward a gender fair language. The use of gender fair language in educational institutions and removal of sexist language as imperative to gender responsiveness is currently being advocated. Gabriela, or General Assembly, binding women for reforms, integrity, equality, leadership, and action. Women's Party National President and Party List Representative Lisa Maza called a ban of sexist language in all official communication and documents in the House of Representatives. The creation of a comprehensive gender fair language policy and the evaluation of the effectiveness of gender fair language in institutions are indicators for a gender fair institution. These actions are small steps one can take in ensuring that institutions are indeed gender fair. Language, then, is more than just the arrangement of words. Cultures and values come from language and vice versa. Language is also a process that represents one's views, beliefs, and experiences. It must be changed to reflect the changes in the world as well as to be free from bias, since words can affect how a person sees oneself and others around him or her.